Welcome back to the phone booth. I'm your host, Joe Pollard. If you would like to support the show, become a patron at www.patreon.com/foolsgallery. About a month ago, I received an email out of the blue with an image attached. It was the second such email in as many days. The image shows a large man in a small, messy mailroom. He is balding, with an ample belly, a broad chest, and cork bottle glasses that frame rosy red cheeks. Several pens stick out of his shirt pocket, and a green tie perfectly clashes with his red suspenders. He looks nothing like a king, nor his mailroom a kingdom, but somehow the image reminds me of both. It makes me smile. Without ever meeting him, I find myself liking this neat, organized man, smiling out of a messy, chaotic room. His name is Mason Demyer. He is 65 years old, and this is his story. Dear Mr. Pollard, my granddaughter Nancy convinced me to write to you. I wouldn't have otherwise. I wanted to, but I've been listening to your podcast and am quite intimidated by the quality of guests. I thought, with that fortune teller boy the internet's all crazy about and the darn LA Union, you would have no interest in talking to an old codger like me. But Nancy can be quite persuasive when she wants to be. She's 9, and when she crosses her arms and sets her jaw, you just know you're about to lose an argument. She gets that from her mother, Sydney, who gets that from my ex-wife. She sure as heck didn't get it from me. So I asked Nancy what story I should tell, and she said, "Don't be stupid, Grandpa. Tell your story." How could you argue with that? So I sat down to write my story, and here's what I came up with. My name is Mason Demyer. I'm 63 years old. I work in the mailroom of a small law firm in Carlsbad, New Mexico. Been here for about 40 years. I'm divorced with 2 children. I'm a grandfather, I'm behind on rent, and I can fly. How is that? Quite a story, right? Nancy didn't think so. She sure was disappointed when I read that to her. She said I had to write about the interesting parts. But when I asked her what the interesting parts were, even my genius tyrant of a granddaughter drew a blank. Job's not that interesting, she reasoned. Neither were my kids. After all, what 9-year-old is interested in her parents? Being divorced is sad, and no one wants to be sad. Same goes for my rent. And yeah, I can fly, but lots of people can fly. What's so interesting about that? The one part of my story that Nancy found worthy of retelling was the one part she was involved in. I was a grandparent. She was interesting. I should write about her. So I started to write a story about Nancy, and here's what I came up with. Long before Nancy was born, back when her mom was her age, I quit my band. We were a punk band called Slim and Poke. We weren't very good, but we played some basements here and there and had some big dreams. But with a baby and a pregnant wife who quit her own band a few years earlier, it was time to face reality. I got a job in a mailroom out here in Carlsbad. Was supposed to stay just long enough to right the ship, and then I'd be back to the band. But then Sydney got chicken pox, and Dee Dee was born. Our car broke down, and one thing led to another, led to another, led to another. Wasn't long before I blinked and 10 years went by. I was still in the mailroom with no road leading out. The girls were becoming teenagers and weren't too interested in their old man anymore. The wife, Arlene, started seeing the mailman, and I didn't even have the energy to resent her for it. It was a rough time. Then B-Day hit, and changed everything. Well, not really changing anything. The family got pretty rudimentary powers. Arlene could heat up her hands, helped with the cooking while the gas was out, but not for much else. Dee Dee's spit turned solid when she wanted it to. Not too big a deal when we realized she wouldn't choke on it, and it saved some money when the roof started to leak. Sydney could make her veins glow in the dark. It was pretty freaky the first time she did it. Scared the heck out of her sister, but altogether, pretty harmless. I was the only one who got a cool power. I could fly. Well, not at first. In the beginning, all I could do was kind of float around. But with the world collapsing, we decided, as a family, to not leave the house until things quieted down. It got a little boring, but the good thing about boredom is that kids will find anything interesting, even if it's their dad. Sydney would throw a dog leash up to me and drag me around the house from room to room, talking the whole time. One day I figured out how to move without the leash, and that's when Sydney got her idea. She wanted me to become a superhero. The world needed saving, she said, and it was up to those with cool powers to do the saving. I wasn't too interested, but Sydney crossed her arms, set her jaw, and I knew I wasn't going to win that argument. Thing was, I wanted nothing to do with it. I've attached a picture to this email. I knew it would take a miracle for my kids to turn the guy in that photo into a superhero. What harm could it do? It wasn't long before Sydney got the whole family in on the project. She had her mother take my measurements on a stepladder. Arlene was as helpless to resist our daughter as I was, and she got to work picking out the colors for my costume. I hovered over her as she worked, getting more and more nervous that I would actually have to put the dang thing on. Dee Dee was put in charge of fitness. A bit of a problem to give a 10-year-old, but she did her best. Exercise without gravity is a tricky thing, and our workout sessions often ended with me squirming around like a turtle flipped on its back. Eventually, we gave up, and Dee Dee began tying protein bars to balloons while reading me old picture books. We went on like that for a few months, working on the costume, trying to lose weight, laughing about the many adventures I would have when I got my powers under control. My favorite time was in the evening, where Sydney would assemble the entire family in the living room to help me pick out a name. We would sit there, throwing around ideas, laughing as they got more and more stupid. The Winged Wonder, Icarus, the Bald Eagle, Skyman, the Jellyfish were just a few suggestions. Arlene argued a little too persuasively for the Bald Eagle, but in the end, Sydney crossed her arms and set her jaw, and that was that. The following evening was the naming ceremony. The girls took it very seriously, dressing up as hooded priests by throwing blankets over their heads and chanting a complicated nonsense rhyme that must have taken days to practice. They also had taken every candle in the house and lit them in a large circle underneath me. And while the effects were certainly stunning, no one seemed to think about how heat rises. I was a little worried my droplets of sweat would extinguish some of the candles, but the kids were so excited I didn't want to ruin it. Sydney climbed up on a stepladder and solemnly tapped both of my shoulders with a yardstick, dubbing me the Peregrine Falcon, a superhero. And then they gave me my new catchphrase, "Stay grinning." I was stupidly proud of them. When the ceremony ended, Sydney gave a satisfied nod. Everything was ready. Now they just had to wait for me to get my powers under control. But to be honest, my powers were under control. I mastered flying in the first month. I only pretended I hadn't. It wasn't just that I didn't want to put on the costume. I didn't. It was this horrible green color that Sydney had become obsessed with ever since her veins started glowing. But the truth is, I was enjoying myself too much. As ridiculous as it sounds, those 3 months pretending to be trapped on the ceiling were the best 3 months of my life. I got to spend time with my girls. But then Arlene finished the costume, and the girls' attention began to lag. They went back to their rooms, waiting impatiently for my powers to catch up to their vision. I broke after a day of not seeing them. I slipped down to the floor while they were getting ready for bed and took the costume out of the closet. I remember being mortified at the sight of it. I swallowed a growing lump in my throat and began to squeeze myself into the darn thing. It took about 15 minutes of sucking my gut in and squishing bits of me that weren't meant to be squished. I mean, heck, that thing was tight. I don't know if you ever put on a costume, but they tend to show off all the parts of the body that aren't where they should be. I kept pushing myself back in order, only for another bit to sag out. In the end, I was forced to rely on the cape to keep my pride. But finally, I got it on. Finally, I was ready. I struck a pose and yelled for the girls to come downstairs. They charged out of their room, Sydney nearly knocking Dee Dee into the wall. Then they saw me, and we laughed and smiled and hugged. Arlene came down tired but happy. The girls inspected the cape and the costume and asked me to fly around the living room, applauding when I did. It seemed, for one moment, that everything was going to be okay. I remember thinking maybe this insane, childish plan would actually work. It was time to take my costume to the streets, to fight crime, to be a hero. I opened the window, and at the last moment I looked back. My daughters beamed, and I couldn't have been more proud. "Stay grinning," I shouted, and leapt into the night. But as my family faded away and the night closed around us, I realized I had no idea what to do next. Was I supposed to find a crime and stop it? How many crimes did you actually find on any given day? How many crimes were there? Where did they happen? And did I really want any part of it? What would I do if I confronted a man with a gun? I could fly, yes, but not nearly as fast as a bullet. And it was cold up there in the sky. The tights didn't give me any warmth at all. The air was thin, and if I flew too fast, my eyes would sting in water. Why hadn't I thought to bring some goggles and a winter jacket? Probably wouldn't have looked as cool. And in the end, it was just lonely up there in the sky. So I floated there, 200 feet off the ground, shivering in my underwear and cape, until the lights in the girls' windows flicked off and I was sure they were asleep. Then I flew back, squeezed out of my costume, folded it in the closet, and went to bed, hoping Dee Dee and Sydney wouldn't want me to put it back on in the morning. But by then, the magic had worn off. The girls seemed to understand that their dad looked silly in tights and didn't bring it up again. They went back to their rooms, and my wife and I went back to not speaking. And just like that, life in the world went back to normal. I went back to the mailroom. A few years later, I got divorced. My kids grew up. Somehow, we scrounged enough together to send them to college. And then, they were just gone, making families of their own, barely enough time in their lives to call. Funny thing about kids, when they're done with you, they're done with you. But life goes on. I play checkers every weekend in the park, eat TV dinners every night in my lazy boy. I've still got the costume in my closet. My kids' fantasy of their father being a hero slowly collecting dust. But then, a few weeks ago, Nancy's cat got stuck in a tree. Don't know how the poor thing got up there. 30 feet off the ground, meowing so loud the neighbors started to complain. Nancy was hysterical. She was so scared that little cat would fall. Sydney didn't know who else to call, so she called me. She called me. This has been a Fool's Gallery production of The Phone Booth. Costume in the Closet was written and directed by Keenan Ellis.